Greetings and welcome to another installment of Quant Slob. This is the fourth in our foundational series, and this time around we're going to foray into the cornerstone of stats and data science, statistical populations, or simply just populations. This is going to be the first part in a three-part micro-series on this topic. The population is huge and absolutely central to all of inferential and predictive data science. In fact, without some population in mind, there would be no hypothesis tests, there would be no confidence intervals, no t-tests, z-tests, chi-square tests, no type 1 errors, type 2 errors, no Cramér-Rao lower bound, no resampling techniques, no Monte Carlo, none of that good stuff. Without the conceptualization of a population, there would be no inferential stats at all. Okay, so where do we start? What's a population? Loosely speaking, a population is a bunch of stuff. And we usually have that the stuff satisfies two requirements, that the stuff is made up of separable or discrete elements or units, and that these units or elements share some overarching commonality. This is jumping way ahead, but it's important and I want to deal with it here. A data scientist watching this might be curious about our usage of the word unit to describe a population element. Be curious, is this alluding somehow to a so-called unit of observation or a unit of analysis? The answer is yes. Ultimately here, a population element can be associated with any unit level of analysis. A population may contain a finite number of elements, or a population may contain an infinite number of elements, either countable or uncountable. One particularly useful point of view, I think, is that all populations fall into one of two categories, concrete or non-concrete, and in turn here you can see non-concrete populations can be further categorized as either imaginary or non-imaginary. We usually consider a population to be concrete when all of its elements can be identified and enumerated. So some examples. All the students enrolled at a particular university at a particular point in time, all the telescopes made by a manufacturer over a past fiscal year, restaurants, customers on a given day. By implication, all concrete populations are finite, of course. When all the units belonging to a concrete population have been listed out or actually enumerated, the result is something routinely known of as a sampling frame. It's called a sampling frame because they are, at least in the old days, typically used to draw a sample. So let's consider some examples here. Suppose our population is all the students enrolled at a particular university on some particular day. The admissions office at the university will have the student information likely somewhere in some database on all current students. An extract of student university IDs could serve as our sampling frame here. Let's try imagining a population comprised of all the bolts manufactured by a particular bolt making machine over the course of a past calendar year. This is certainly a finite population, but the question here is, would we regard this population as concrete? You recall that for a population to be regarded as concrete, we usually require that the elements be enumerable, uniquely itemizable, like in the previous example with university students. If the bolts we're talking about are common commercial hardware, it is rather unlikely that each bolt will be tagged with some unique identifier. On the other hand, if the bolts we're talking about are highly specialized, like critical aerospace hardware, the machine or process that created them may stamp a unique ID onto each of the bolts. And since in this particular case the elements would be itemizable, we can regard this population as concrete. If any of the elements that belong to a population don't exist or otherwise cannot be identified or enumerated, the population is usually regarded as non-concrete. So some examples here. All the people that have resided on what is currently the geographic region called Hawaii, all the telescopes that have ever been made, all the possible gameplay outcomes of an upcoming sports game. In the first example, there's been a lot of efforts made to trace ancestral lines of modern Hawaiian families to the intrepid Polynesians that populated the islands starting 1700 some odd years ago. But even if the project were ever totally completed, it would be a far cry from identifying all the historical inhabitants. So we would regard this as being non-concrete. Similarly, the elements in the second example are not enumerable, so it would also be considered non-concrete. The third example is a little trickier here. This contains elements that neither exist nor could they ever exist. It would therefore be purely hypothetical and, for our purposes, imaginary or abstract. There exists a special type or category of population that is abstract, but also not purely theoretical. This special type of population is, to be perfectly honest, quite mysterious, perplexing, and even in its scientific usage nowadays, somewhat controversial. And yet, in the larger scheme of things, this type of population may be the most important of them all. That's going to do it this time around. Thank you so very much for tuning in. Really do appreciate it. And don't forget to stay tuned for more Quant Slob.